This is the biggest prosecution in the state of New Mexico in a number of years. The biggest challenge that Alec Baldwin's going to be facing in his long career, and his defense team, it's the biggest case that most likely that they have dealt with or will deal with for a long time. There's a lot on the line.
It's the highly anticipated jury trial nearly 3 years in the making. A-list celebrity Alec Baldwin is finally heading to trial, years after the deadly shooting on the Rust movie set.
This is the big leagues for both sides on this case, and their tensions are running high.
Baldwin is accused of involuntary manslaughter in the death of cinematographer Halyna Hutchins, but he says he never pulled the trigger.
It wasn't in the script for the trigger to be pulled.
Well, the trigger wasn't pulled. I didn't pull the trigger.
That interview was years ago. So will Baldwin refresh his story and tell it to a new audience?
You run the risk of a jury saying, well, where does the line end? Where does the acting begin and where does the acting stop?
But that's not the only task Baldwin's defense now faces.
Baldwin's team has to make sure this jury understands, if they want to get an acquittal, the jury understands that a film set is not real life. A film set is unlike anything else that anyone has ever experienced before.
The trial comes months after the conviction of Rust armorer Halyna Gutierrez Reed, and experts say New Mexico prosecutors are still riding that high.
They know how to get a conviction in front of a Santa Fe County jury, and they know what facts work.
But that's not to say we won't see anything new.
This is really the prosecutor's chance to bring out everything that we haven't seen yet.
One thing's for sure, all eyes will be on New Mexico come next week.
And there's kind of a tortured history of this case.
To get a better idea of what to expect at Alec Baldwin's coming trial, we spoke with former prosecutor and defense attorney John Day. You're right there in New Mexico on the ground in Santa Fe. What is the reaction there at this coming trial that Alec Baldwin, an A-list celebrity, is going to be on trial?
Well, there's a lot of attention in this town being paid to it. New Mexico is a poor state, and so we have this film and TV program where the state kicks back tax credits to film productions, right? So Santa Fe is the scene of a lot of filming these days for the last couple of years. It's almost $1 billion that the film industry spends in New Mexico, and people are aware of what's going on. A lot of productions are shooting, a lot of Westerns are shooting. That's why Baldwin's production company came out here. They were shooting this relatively low budget Western film at a film ranch, one of these old West towns that's just a little bit out of town. It looks like an old West town that's been recreated, kind of like Disneyland. And they do a lot of productions there. So there's been a lot of attention paid to this because the film business in New Mexico is one of the few positive industries that we have, and the Baldwin shooting has garnered a ton of attention around town.
All this started on October 21st, 2021, when emergency responders were called to the Bonanza Creek Ranch in Santa Fe, New Mexico. At the time, the location was being used as a set for the low-budget Western movie Rust. The movie's producer and star, Alec Baldwin. It was between takes when rehearsing a scene that Baldwin's Colt .45 handgun went off. Cinematographer Halyna Hutchins and director Joel Souza were both shot. Souza's injuries were severe. The bullet had lodged in his spine, and he was taken from the set by an ambulance. He was treated at a Santa Fe hospital and survived, but the severity was much worse for Hutchins. The bullet had passed through her upper body and she was in need of immediate care. Hutchins was airlifted to a trauma center in Albuquerque, where she later died.
I do have some very unfortunate news to tell you.
What?
She didn't make it. Yeah. So Joel's still at the hospital, but the other person involved didn't make it.
That was just the start of the controversy. In the months after the shooting, news broke about alleged negligence on the set. Before the deadly shooting, there had been 2 accidental firings of blank rounds, and several crew members had resigned out of safety concerns. The investigation soon zeroed in on Baldwin because he was holding the weapon, but also 24-year-old Halyna Gutierrez Reed, the movie's armorer. Reports noted that Gutierrez Reed was inexperienced as an armorer, and prosecutors alleged negligence. The timeline of the case has a bit of a back and forth, with a switch of prosecutors in New Mexico, charges filed, dropped, and then filed once again. There was a bit of back and forth because after this happened way back in 2021, we weren't sure whether charges were going to be filed. Then they were dropped, then they were charged once again. So, why do you think that prosecutors down in New Mexico really stuck with this involuntary manslaughter this time around?
But you've got to go back, and there's kind of a tortured history of this case. There was a DA involved, the elected district attorney in Santa Fe, and then she brought in a special prosecutor who then had to drop out because she was running for office. And then they brought in new special prosecutors. So, I mean, it's been a bit of a mess getting to this point in the prosecution. But at the end of the day, the theory seems to be by all the different prosecutors on this case that in New Mexico, if you're handling a gun that's a real gun, you are responsible for what comes out of the end of the barrel. You are responsible for knowing what's in there. And so their theory seems to be, doesn't matter if it was a film set, it doesn't matter, what the circumstances were. This was a real gun, and whoever was holding it is going to be held responsible for whatever happens to come out of that barrel.
Ultimately, both Baldwin and Gutierrez Reed were charged with involuntary manslaughter. Gutierrez Reed's trial came first, and a verdict was handed down in March of this year.
We find the defendant, Halyna Gutierrez, guilty of involuntary manslaughter as charged in count 1. We find the defendant, Halyna Gutierrez, not guilty of tampering with evidence as charged in count 2.
Gutierrez Reed would go on to receive the maximum sentence for that conviction, 18 months in prison. That's the same sentence Baldwin now faces for the same charge. So the specific charge that Alec Baldwin is facing is involuntary manslaughter. And here on Law and Crime, I cover a lot of first-degree murder, second-degree, but not as many involuntary manslaughter. So can you really break down that charge for me?
Right. It's the lowest level homicide charge. Basically, it means somebody died and somebody did something that didn't amount to a serious crime that led to the death. Was it something like recklessness? Was it negligence? What was it that caused the inadvertent, unintentional death of another person? And, in New Mexico, we've seen this used most recently in the conviction of Halyna Gutierrez Reed, the armorer on this case. She's now doing 18 months in a women's prison because a jury found her guilty of involuntary manslaughter. It's technically the same charge that Alec Baldwin is facing. The alleged facts are a little bit different, but at the end of the day, he's also facing a fourth-degree felony, lowest level felony, involuntary manslaughter charge.
Law and Crime followed Gutierrez Reed's 10-day trial, where we heard from weaponry experts, firsthand witnesses like Joel Souza, and saw videos from the Rust set. You alluded to this a bit before, but we already saw a trial with the armorer, Halyna Gutierrez Reed, and we saw the outcome. She was convicted and now is serving a prison sentence. So could that almost be a roadmap for what we could see in the coming Alec Baldwin trial?
I think it is exactly a roadmap. What we've seen is the prosecution team has already had one bite at the apple here. They've had one chance to fine-tune their presentation, to fine-tune the prosecution. And that's what's, I think, confusing in the minds of some people. It's like they've already found one person accountable. One person has been held criminally liable for the death of Halyna Hutchins, the photographer on Rust. And so in the minds of a lot of people, why is Alec Baldwin also being tried when the young armorer, has already been convicted and sentenced to prison? And that's one of the issues that I think is dividing a lot of people, not just in New Mexico, but around the country. It's why, when there's already been this person held criminally liable, why is Alec Baldwin also facing charges?
I want to thank Morgan & Morgan for sponsoring this news story. I mean, I think it's pretty clear from the cases Law and Crime covers that the world isn't always the safest place. So when you're hurt, it can be confusing and you don't know where to turn. Well, Morgan & Morgan is the largest injury law firm in America. Morgan & Morgan has completely modernized the personal injury claim process, so you can submit a claim and find out if you have a case, all from your phone. You can start a claim in 8 clicks or less without having to leave your couch at forthepeople.com/LCnews. John Day theorizes that much of Baldwin's trial will be similar to the prosecution's case against Gutierrez Reed.
I think we are going to see the basic roadmap is going to be the same. The overarching theory by the prosecution is these people are responsible one way or the other. In the case of Baldwin, it seems like they're using these sort of double-barreled theory. One is he was holding the gun. He should have known what was in there. Even if someone on a movie set says, hey, this is a safe gun, you don't have to worry about what's in there. The theory of the prosecution seems to be, it doesn't matter what somebody tells you, you have to check for yourself. The second part of their theory seems to be Baldwin is an executive producer, basically a CEO of this production, and there's evidence, according to the prosecution, that he was he was trying to rush things along. It was a low budget production. They hired people who didn't know what they were doing. There was a lot of emphasis on moving quickly to try to save money. And the prosecutor's theory seems to be that led to recklessness. That led to this criminal recklessness that led to a death. And so they're going after him under the sort of double-barreled, no pun intended, theory that he was this person who not only did he hold the gun, not only should he have checked to see what was in the gun, but it was his recklessness and to pushing this production along and not spending time on safety issues, not spending time on making sure that the set was safe, that people understood the safe procedures and things like that. So they're going after him. Two different theories. It could be that both theories get to a jury, and a jury gets to decide. At the end of the day, we don't know how much of this is actually going to get in front of a jury, but that seems to be where the prosecutors are going.
And while prosecutors might repeat some of the things we heard in the past trial, Day expects we will see some new information too. When we followed along with Hannah Gutierrez Reed's trial, we saw some clips from the movie, the shooting, a little bit of behind the scenes things. So we kind of already have an idea of some of the evidence that prosecutors would bring forth. Do you think that they'll have additional new elements that we haven't yet seen?
It seems like there are going to be a number of things that were not presented in the Hannah Gutierrez Reed trial that Alec Baldwin's trial will see. There's a lot of talk already about emphasizing what he was like on the set. The prosecutors in their pretrial pleadings have talked about him being sort of this autocratic, tyrannical guy who was running roughshod over the crew. He was putting this emphasis on moving things along quickly. And that's obviously going to be one of the avenues that the prosecutors are going to follow, which was he was the driving force behind this sort of reckless, negligent approach to safety on the set. Now, we didn't see that necessarily as much in the Hannah Gutierrez Reed trial, although they certainly alluded to some of it. So this is really the prosecutor's chance to bring out everything that we haven't seen yet. And is there going to be evidence we haven't heard of? Not so much. I mean, I think we know generally what's going to be coming down the road because there've been so many pretrial motions and hearings, and Baldwin's team. It's a really fantastic team of lawyers. They're litigating this thing the way that they should, and he's certainly getting his money's worth. At the end of the day, though, it hasn't led to many victories for him. This judge seems to want to let this jury decide this case.
So we can likely predict what prosecutors will say. Baldwin was responsible as a producer on the movie and was negligent in that regard, pushing the production forward even when safety concerns had been brought to his attention. So what could we expect from the defense? So let's talk about Baldwin's team, because we've spoken a bit about prosecutors, but on the opposite end of things, what do you think they're going to bring forward as far as a defense? What sort of tactics could they be employing?
Right. Baldwin's team has to do, basically, they have one job, and that is to convince the Santa Fe County jury that a film set, a movie set, is unlike real life. On a film set, people are bringing you coffee. They're putting your shoes on your feet. They're brushing your hair. They're putting your makeup on. They're telling you where to go. They're telling you where to sit. They're telling you when you can take a break. And so if someone hands you a gun and says this gun is safe, why should you be thinking anything otherwise? So Baldwin's team has to make sure this jury understands, if they want to get an acquittal, the jury understands that a film set is not real life. A film set is unlike anything else that anyone has ever experienced before. And if they can do that successfully, they'll get an acquittal, or at the very least, a hung jury.
What sort of witnesses do we feel that the defense would bring on in order to do that, your theory, showing that Hollywood or a film set is a little bit different than real life? Do you think Baldwin himself could take the stand?
That's such an interesting question. Who knows if he's going to take the stand? I mean, it cuts both ways, because if you're a defense lawyer and your client is an actor, you run the risk of a jury saying, well, where does the line end? Where does the acting begin and where does the acting stop? He's a compelling person in a lot of ways. Is he going to take the stand? I have no idea. I mean, I've been doing prosecution and defense for years. And of course, the rule of thumb is you don't want your client on the stand. But this case is unlike any other. And, there's been nothing like it, at least in our experience. The witnesses that they're going to have to present, experts, people who can educate a jury in a very sort of appealing and amiable way about film sets, because most people on this jury are not going to have any idea of what life is like on a movie set. And if Baldwin's expert witnesses, if his people can say, look, let me explain a film set to you. This is what it is. And there's no reason that Alec Baldwin should have had any reason to doubt that the gun that somebody handed him was anything but safe. They're going to have people who can lay that out in a very clear and convincing way to a jury that film sets are not real life.
The public has heard from Baldwin a few times since the shooting, but most memorably in his Good Morning America interview in December 2021.
It wasn't in the script for the trigger to be pulled.
Well, the trigger wasn't pulled. I didn't pull the trigger.
So you never pulled the trigger?
No. I would never point a gun at anyone and pull a trigger at them, never.
This exact interview was discussed at Gutierrez Reed's trial when a detective with the Santa Fe County Sheriff's Office took the stand. She says experts took apart the gun to prove Baldwin had to pull the trigger for the shooting to occur.
Now, we understand from previous testimony that you sent the gun that was being used by Mr. Baldwin to the FBI for testing. Is that correct?
Yes, we did.
And prior to the testing being done with the mallet, were you notified that that testing could potentially result in damage to the gun?
Yes.
And what was the reason that you proceeded with the testing anyway?
We proceeded with the testing because Mr. Baldwin had made statements that he didn't pull the trigger, and I think his exact statement was that the gun just went off. So we needed to figure out how to disprove that theory or that statement, and that was the way that was proposed to us and what the FBI could do.
And if we're talking about expert witnesses, we know this from Hannah Gutierrez Reed's trial, that the prosecution brought forth experts that said this gun would not have fired, a bullet would not have left the barrel if the trigger hadn't been pulled. But then we have this very famous interview with George Stephanopoulos where Alec Baldwin says, I didn't pull the trigger. So how does the defense combat that?
Yeah, and right. And this is why if you're a defense lawyer, the last thing you want is your client, even if he's an A-list Hollywood actor, giving a pretrial interview in which he makes statements that are going to come back to haunt him. That's exactly what happened here. His people are going to have to explain that out because the prosecution has that. That's one of the mainstays of their case. Their building blocks for their prosecution is Baldwin's claim. And it seems like that's partly what generated this case moving forward. Like the prosecutors saw that. And we have some information, some indication that they were infuriated that, you had a dead person here and Baldwin went on national television when he should have kept his mouth shut. And that would have been the best practice, and made statements that generated a lot of prosecutorial interest. So it's a good example of why no matter what your client, whether it's someone who's high profile A-list actor or someone who's not in that category, you don't want anyone making statements pre-trial. And that's a classic example of how it can hurt you.
We have an idea of what to expect at Baldwin's trial because of Gutierrez Reed's trial, and we'll probably see some repetition. But Day says Baldwin's defense could use that repetition to their advantage. Another aspect of this case, we talked about it a bit, is the parallels between this and the Hannah Gutierrez Reed trial. So she obviously played a role as an armorer, so her information may be relevant to Baldwin's trial. But what do we expect? Could all of the information from that trial be used in this trial? Like, could prosecutors refer back to that? How would that work?
Right. And that's one of the issues that Baldwin's defense team keeps bringing up, which is, look, the prosecution, you staked out your case against Hannah Gutierrez Reed, and you better be consistent. You can't now change your story to come after Alec Baldwin with a different fact pattern, with a different tale of what happened than you used in the Hannah Gutierrez Reed trial. And that's been the subject of a bunch of pretrial motions by Baldwin's defense team. But, we know from the Hannah Gutierrez Reed trial that, one, this prosecution team can get a conviction. I mean, they know how to get a conviction in front of a Santa Fe County jury, and they know what facts work and that along those lines. And so, Baldwin's team is going to have to be focusing not only on the fact that it was a movie set and no one should be thinking that's real life. They've got to be focusing on the fact that someone's already been held responsible, and that's this young armorer who should have been paying attention to what was going into the guns, and she wasn't. The other side of that, though, it's a double-edged sword, because who hired the armorer? I mean, it was Baldwin. Maybe not he himself, but he was the executive producer or an executive producer on this film set. And that's what feeds into the prosecution's theory that this was such a sloppy operation that it was foreseeable that someone was going to get hurt or killed. And Halyna Gutierrez Reed was the sort of the last person in line, but who put her in that space? It was essentially the production. And if they can pin Baldwin to that, if they can tie him into the recklessness and the sloppiness on the set, the prosecutors might have a better shot at getting their second trial conviction in this case.
So we've covered what we could expect from the coming trial, with one notable exception. We've talked a lot about both sides, the prosecution and then the defense, but a major player or players in this case would be the jury. I mean, they're the ones who are going to make the decision here. So what would prosecutors and the defense be looking forward to when they're going through jury selection? Who would be an ideal juror?
Right. So let's look specifically at where we are with Santa Fe, New Mexico. New Mexico is a largely rural state. If you grew up here, chances are you grew up hunting, or maybe you grew up around guns. If you moved here from elsewhere, we get a lot of people here moving here from Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, New York, Dallas, Houston. If you grew up in a city, maybe you didn't grow up around guns, or you have a feeling about guns that the people who were maybe born here don't have. And so your jury in Santa Fe County, in Santa Fe, New Mexico, has the potential to be sort of evenly split between people who grew up being comfortable around guns, people who grew up thinking, I don't want to be anywhere near a gun. And it's going to come down to it, like any serious criminal case. It's going to come down to the makeup of the jury and who the prosecutors and the defense can get on there, who's the least objectionable. But, if you have people who grew up here, grew up hunting, and they're familiar with how guns operate, they're familiar with gun safety, that might be someone as a prosecutor you want on the jury, because those people know that from a young age, you don't point a gun at anything you don't intend to shoot, and anything that comes out of the barrel is your responsibility. On the other hand, the defense is going to be looking for people who might be much more sympathetic to a film set situation where everything's artificial, everything's done for the actors, for the talent. And who would say, well, look, if someone hands me a gun and says, it's a movie set, there's nothing in this gun that's going to hurt anybody, and why should I disbelieve them? Those people are going to be much more predisposed to favor Baldwin. So the jury selection obviously is going to be key, but you're going to be picking from a pool of people who are either somewhat familiar with hunting and gun safety, and you're going to have another bunch of people who are relatively new here who think that the guns are inherently dangerous, and we don't want to know anything about it. But if someone told me that there was nothing in this gun that could hurt anybody, why should I disbelieve them?
It remains to be seen what sort of decision jurors will come to. But if Baldwin is found guilty, he faces 18 months behind bars. And I think that's really the question on everyone's mind. Obviously, are jurors going to return a guilty verdict or not guilty? But let's say way down the line, they do return a guilty verdict. What are the odds that Alec Baldwin is actually going to serve prison time?
Yeah, well, that's just the ultimate question here. I'll tell you, this judge has already sentenced the young armorer to 18 months. Now, some of that may have been due to some things after the conviction. She was sitting at post-conviction. She was in the county jail. And as every defense lawyer will tell you, if you're sitting in jail, do not say anything on the telephone or to any visitor that's damaging, because everything is recorded. And what happened here was the prosecution got the audio recordings of things, the phone calls that she had made, that the armorer had made while sitting post-conviction in jail. And she said a lot of disparaging things about witnesses and about the case and about the people involved. And I think this judge, and I've been in front of this judge many, many times. She's a very, very good judge, a very tough judge. I've been yelled at by her a lot, which to me is a good sign. But I know that she's a tough sentencer. And in this case, she sentenced the armorer to the maximum. I think that if there is a conviction, Alec Baldwin very likely could be getting, maybe not the maximum, but he could be getting some time in a state prison.
But is it possible that all this could have been avoided with a simple plea deal? I've also seen reports that prosecutors were in the process of moving forward with a plea deal with Alec Baldwin, but then they got wind that Baldwin may have been pressuring some of the witnesses, people who worked on the set, to sit down for interviews for a documentary. Have you heard anything about that?
Right. There's some indication that the prosecutors would have been satisfied with what they thought was a reasonable plea deal, and they were floating a deal like that, or they had an intention to. And then once again, Baldwin, for whatever reason, taking steps, taking actions that would come back to really hurt him. But it shows you, again, if you're a defense lawyer, you want your client locked down pre-trial. You don't want anything to get on anybody's radar screen. If he had done these things, and I'm sure his attorneys were telling him, do not do these interviews, do not take steps, do not get involved in anything. But for whatever reason, these things occurred, and now there are certainly things that Baldwin's team has to deal with. But it does seem like these extraneous things may have played a role in some prosecutorial decisions. And as a former prosecutor, some of that is troubling to me, because you want your prosecutorial decisions to be made without, reference to things that are happening outside the case. You don't want to make it seem like you are retaliating, or that your feelings got hurt, or that something behind your prosecutorial decisions is based on something other than just the cold hard facts and doing justice and applying the law to the facts. When you get into all these other areas, like interviews with ABC and films that are being made and witnesses who are theoretically being pressured, or at least talked to about their role in the case, it messes up your prosecution, and it also might generate some animosity that wouldn't be there otherwise.
Whatever happens when it comes time to trial, one thing's for sure: all eyes will be on Alec Baldwin.
This has generated, between the two sides, there's been a lot of personal animosity, a lot of ad hominem attacks by both sides on the character of the defense and on the prosecution and on Baldwin. And it's getting really personal. And it's easy to sort of step back and say, well, as a former prosecutor, as a defense lawyer, you never want to let it get to that point. The reality is this is the big leagues for both sides in this case, and their tensions are running high. And there's been a lot of basically name calling by both sides, but that reflects what's at stake here. I mean, this is, for whatever reason, and no matter how it got here, this is the biggest prosecution in the state of New Mexico in a number of years. The biggest challenge that Alec Baldwin's going to be facing in his long career, and his defense team, it's the biggest case that most likely that they have dealt with or will deal with for a long time. There's a lot on the line, and everyone is getting very, very tense, and tempers are getting short, and people are saying things that in an ideal world, in an ideal courtroom, you wouldn't say. But that just reflects what's at stake, and how serious this is, and how much people are paying attention.
Jury selection in Baldwin's trial is expected for Tuesday, July 9th. You can follow the entire trial live right here on our YouTube page. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Gillespie.